Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discoveries, and our discussions with respect to this really splendid set, which is the Kino Classics Blu-ray version of Pioneers of African American Cinema. And as some of you may know, we have been exploring each of the films that are included in this really wonderful set. And we now find ourselves in the discussion of the films that are contained within the fourth Blu-ray disc that is part of this set. And as we also know, among those films, or those films that are found on such fourth Blu-ray disc, are the sound films of that incredible filmmaker and artist from the 20th century, who is Oscar Micheaux. What is such an important and innovative, independent filmmaker, spirit, and artist. And his sound films are a very interesting bunch indeed. And today let us focus in on that sound film from Micheaux, which is from 1938, and it is called Birthright. This film, Birthright, I think, is a really brilliant encapsulation of so many of the key themes of Oscar Micheaux's cinema. Again, it also expressed or embodied in this film, which has many parts sound film entertainment. There are a number of song and dance number routines that I think have become customary in the sound era of Micheaux's work. We also have film that deals with family and family drama and a sense of injustice, and also a sense of justice and the pursuit of justice, and the idea of hard work and education that may or may not pay off in the long run when it comes to the further development of family ties and the tensions that are associated with the discovery of such family ties and the revelation of various past secrets and the like. And so there's a lot here in terms of a type of entertainment, drama, melodrama that is also filled with a number of musical numbers and also in this package of an Oscar Micheaux sound film. So there is a lot here in terms of the entertainment aspects of this. And also as an Oscar Micheaux film, there are a number of very compelling themes or handling of these themes, which I think also can be said to be very much part of the Oscar Micheaux filmography that we have seen all the way back since the silent films or the surviving silent films that are found elsewhere on this set. And so what are some of those themes? For instance, this film Birthright speaks about or talks about or otherwise discusses or handles the notion of the divide or dichotomy or compare and contrast handling of urban life and rural life, or life in the city and life in the country. And this is personified, or not personified, but it's expressed in a number of means in the film. For instance, we do have the rural setting in terms of the character of Peter, who returns from his life being educated at Harvard and now returning to his mother and trying to establish some kind of school for the African American community, because he understands that the heart of a type of success and also a type of prosperity in terms of community and its values is in education. And so that's his goal in terms of his return here. But already in that setup, or in that character setup, is the the notion of the promise of the city life versus the importance and value of the rural community, excuse me. And so that's embodied in the objectives of Peter. That's also embodied in his background. That's also embodied in the way that Oscar Micheaux seems to go back and forth among these various settings. And so this is, I think, something that we have seen elsewhere. If we recall in some of his early work in particular, and also in his writings as well, we have the idea of the homestead life versus the city or urban life, and how sometimes one mode of living may or may not have all the answers for the various characters that we meet. And again, that might also be tied to Oscar Micheaux's own life and biography, and the type of value that he placed on what is described as the homesteader life, life in the wilderness, life in order to be able to forge one's own way forward in this independent, pioneering spirit, while at the same time showing us the type of maybe economic prosperity promise of the urban life and modernity and all of the pluses and minuses that come with the aspects of modernity, including, of course, the very exciting nightlife and the musical dance numbers that, again, are part of the great background and scenery of the sound film landscape of Oscar Micheaux. So this is one dynamic or one theme that I think is very much part of the scenario. And again, inherent in the plot itself, because as we understand, this is one of the main objectives of Peter in order to be able to further the prosperity and benefits of this rural community by trying to establish a school. And this is also very important too, because if we carry this theme further, we understand too that during this period, or starting from the earlier part of the 20th century, there is this idea in history, which is also discussed by Professor Jacqueline Stewart in the writings that are included in this booklet and elsewhere, about the idea of urban migration, or the migration of the populace out of the towns and into the urban centers in order to follow the opportunities for job and labor. And so what this meant was the migration routes were out of the rural areas into the cities, whereas Micheaux, in this and other works, seems to be suggesting the opposite route, or maybe maintaining a sense of the rural community and the importance of the rural community, despite any kind of socio-economic forces that might be at play and that might otherwise compel the movement forward. And there's an extra added bit of irony too, because if we recall, Peter's background in education was actually one that took him out of the rural community, only to have him return later upon his graduation. So there's, I think, a little bit of irony there, which makes for some very compelling and challenging types of considerations of these themes, which is, I think, part of the norm when we are considering the many aspects of the challenging dynamics of Oscar Micheaux's cinema, from, as I say, the silent period all the way up to the sound period, including this film, Birthright. So this is one, I think, very important pillar or foundation of this particular work, which is, as I say, exemplary of Oscar Micheaux's filmography writ large. Yet another example, or another theme that makes this film Birthright, I think, very key in the filmography of Oscar Micheaux, is the idea of education. Now, we've mentioned it already in the context of the rural-urban divide. That is one theme of Oscar Micheaux's work, but it's education that is another. We have seen in past works, for instance, Within Our Gates in the Silent Era, and others, in Body and Soul, etc., the importance of education and the idea how education and schooling is seen by Oscar Micheaux and others to be one of the ways in which the African American communities that are depicted within these stories, and that are also a reflection of the realities of the current day, how education is seen to be one of the solutions, or perhaps the most important solution, in terms of a betterment of the individual, and also thus a betterment of society and the community overall. And we see that the various generations, also have place this great importance on education, such that education seems to pave the way to more opportunity, or at least the possibility for more opportunity, or perhaps to make it even more nuanced, paves the way for what might be said or perceived to be opportunity, but perhaps is more illusory than one might have initially perceived it to be. But in any event, the notion of education is very important, even in very fundamental terms, as, say, the possibility of some kind of financial or economic or societal-based prosperity. So we see this embodied in what Peter is trying to do, and his goal in trying to get the property in order to turn it into some kind of place of education, a school. He is, of course, thwarted by certain forces of the community, which are trying to cheat him out of this property, and he's also prevented from being able to do this because on both sides of what Professor Musser refers to in this booklet as the color line, because it is this perceived as a type of weakness. And so he is in a very difficult situation economically, even though he is trying in the long run to establish some kind of possibility for education. But this is, I think, taking a step back. This is yet another example of the importance that Oscar Micheaux and the characters of his stories are placing on the possibility for education, and thus the importance of establishing these schools for the communities in order for them to at least have the hopes for chances of prosperity. And again, there is a line of optimism that runs through this film, as well as other Oscar Micheaux films, whenever it deals with this particular theme or topic. And then yet another third main fundamental theme that can be said to be part of this film, and thus part of the overall filmography of Oscar Micheaux, is what I referred to just a while ago, borrowing a phrase from Professor Charles Musser, who describes it also as part of the writings in this book, and there's the notion of the color line. And the color line is a phrase used by Professor Musser to describe that divide or that division or that type of societal structure which is otherwise premised upon notions of inherent or systemic racial prejudice. And so the idea of this divide, which it could be also classified in some form or another to be maybe a divide that is related to class divides as well, but it's also primarily a racially based one. And so the idea of divisions within society based on race, or occurring or arising due to or as a result of racial or prejudicial attitudes of society, is expressed in various characters of the films of Oscar Micheaux, including, of course, Birthright, when we see this community and we see how a number of people are trying to, say, cheat Peter out of this property, writing in a very sneakily written clause in the deed, forbidding any type of activity that Peter would otherwise be seeking, and Peter trying to get a sense of justice, but perhaps there is pressures on both sides, perhaps from his mother or from other people from his community, which seems to be suggesting that maybe Peter is weak and that he was fooled and that he was stupid because he allowed himself to be fooled. So he is trapped in this type of dilemma in which he is considered to be a type of, maybe in some ways to be somewhat inept, or maybe even ineffectual when it comes to trying to effectuate those goals that he has in mind, those very quite ambitious and very admirable goals that he would otherwise have, but he is thwarted and he is rendered particularly vulnerable. But this is an example of the color line at play in one example, because we see how the community and both sides of the community seem to be targeting or seem to be focusing their frustration on Peter and what it is he's trying to do, again, in terms of what it is he's trying to do or what it is he is unable to do. So there is the color line, perhaps embodied most strikingly in the character of Peter himself. And I mention actually the character of Peter in the context of Charles Musser's phrase, the color line, because another way that he is, in a sense, a type of focal point of this color line, and perhaps also the blurring of the color line, is the story where we become more involved with Peter and his background and his family and where it is he came from. And the film reveals a lot of information, a lot of very dramatic information in almost a type of soap opera entertainment type of way. And I mean that in a very positive way, but a type of soap opera entertainment in terms of who Peter is and where he came from. And the secrets of his heritage and where he came from are, in fact, I think, very emblematic and quite directly emblematic of what Charles Musser also refers to as not just the color line, but indeed the blurring of the color line. And we have seen concepts or notions or treatments of characters and the handling of the, I think, very directly relevant theme and very directly relevant to the stories of various characters in many Oscar Micheaux's films in terms of relationships between people who are of different racial backgrounds and miscegenation, and what this means, not just in terms of the current social climates, but also the consequences for future generations. And we see this embodied in the story of Peter and what the consequences are, who his parents may or may not be, and what that means for Peter in his current situation. So this story, Peter's story, is in many ways the ultimate embodiment of Charles Musser's take on Oscar Micheaux's films and the color line, and not just the color line, but the blurring of the color line. So so to take it a step back, the story of Peter and the school and the cheating with regard to the real estate deed, that could be said to be maybe an embodiment of the solidification of the rigidity of the color line on the one hand, but yet at the same time, when we get into the details of Peter's background and family, we get a sense of the possibility of the blurring of the color line. So the rigidity of the color line and the blurring of the color line are both embodied all at once at the same time in the story of Peter. So this is, I think, a very type of provocative and very dynamic and challenging mode of sort of cinematic expression that we have come to expect from the great cinema artistry that is the powerful filmography of Oscar Micheaux. And so we see here in Birthright all those handlings and treatments and concerns that we have seen from the very early days of the silent film era of Micheaux's work, but now we see it embodied in such a very entertaining and yet thought-provoking manner. And I should say, too, that there are some really neat tricks of visual style and flair, as well as the continuation of the playful sound era nature of Micheaux. There are some interesting ways in which music is blending in with title cards and how that's suggestive of certain action set pieces that are also happening at the same time on camera. And the way characters are framed and shot, and they are the compositions are composed themselves. This really is, I think, a really fantastic standout example of Oscar Micheaux's sound films. And so we've also acknowledged, I think, in the context or the conversation of the past sound works also included on this fourth disc, we've also acknowledged that there might be perhaps a type of shaky aspect to some of that filmmaking. He's a very independent spirit, Oscar Micheaux is, and perhaps in some of the earlier sound films it might have been a little bit too shaky, a little bit too rough around the edges. But regardless of how you might have felt about some of those earlier sound films, I think we can also see there is a real sense of a really lovely established composition in terms of the way in which characters are framed in various situations here, at least relative to some of the earlier sound works. In any event, I think this is a really exemplary and fine example, not just of the sound era of Oscar Micheaux, but in fact the cinema of Oscar Micheaux. And I think we have come to the end, or almost the end, of Disc 4. There is another film that we can talk about, but in terms of Oscar Micheaux's works that are included in the set, Pioneers of African American Cinema, this is the last that we have included here. So I think when we think about that as well, and we that further, I think, enhances just how powerful this film Birthright sits in the filmography. As I say, not just in terms of the way in which it stands on its own, in terms of the mix of entertaining levels of melodrama, drama, and soap opera, but also the way in which the film sits very comfortably, very neatly, and actually very wonderfully in the context of the overall filmography of this great artist who is Oscar Micheaux. And so this is the film Birthright. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.